Part 2, to be read after purchase. This is not so much a preface, actually, as it is an explanation of why this new version of The Stand exists at all. It was a long novel to begin with, and this expanded version will be regarded by some, perhaps many, as an act of indulgence by an author whose works have been successful enough to allow it. I hope not, but I'd have to be pretty stupid not to realize that such criticism is in the offing. After all, many critics of the novel regarded it bloated and overlong to begin with. Whether the book was too long to begin with or has become so in this edition is a matter I leave to the individual reader. I only wanted to take this little space to say that I am republishing The Stand as it was originally written, not to serve myself or any individual reader, but to serve a body of readers who have asked to have it. I would not offer it if I myself didn't think those portions which were dropped from the original manuscript made the story a richer one, and I'd be a liar if I didn't admit I am curious as to what its reception will be. I'll spare you the story of how The Stand came to be written. The chain of thought which produces a novel rarely interests anyone but aspiring novelists. They tend to believe there is a secret formula to writing a commercially successful novel, but there isn't. You get an idea, at some point another idea kicks in. Usually you make a connection or a series of them between ideas. A few characters, usually little more than shadows at first, suggest themselves. A possible ending occurs to the writer's mind, although when the ending comes it's one much like the one the writer envisioned, and at some point the novelist sits down with a paper and pen, a typewriter, or a word cruncher. When asked, "How do you write?" I answer invariably, one word at a time, and the answer is invariably dismissed. But that is all it is. It sounds too simple to be true, but consider the Great Wall of China, if you will. One stone at a time, ma'am. That's all. One stone at a time. But I've read you can see that motherfucker from space without a telescope. For readers who are interested, the story is told in the final chapter of Danse Macabre, a rambling but user-friendly overview of the horror genre I published in 1981. This ain't a commercial for that book, I'm just saying the tale's there if you want it. Although it's told not because it is interesting in itself, but to illustrate an entirely different point. For the purposes of this book, what's important is that approximately 400 pages of manuscript were deleted from the final draft. The reason was not an editorial one. If that had been the case, then I would be content to let the book live its life and die its eventual death as it was originally published. The cuts were made at the behest of the accounting department. They totaled up production costs, like these next to the hardcover sales of my previous 4 books, and decided that a cover price of $12.95 was about what the market would bear. Compare that price to this one, friends and neighbors. I was asked if I would like to make the cuts, or if I would prefer someone in the editorial department to do it. I agreed reluctantly to do the surgery myself. I think I did a fairly good job for a writer who has been accused over and over again of having diarrhea of the word processor. There's only one place, Trash Can Man's trip across the country from Indiana to Nevada, that seems noticeably scarred in the original version. If all of the story is there, one might ask, then why bother? Isn't it indulgence after all? It better not be. If it is, then I've spent a large portion of my life wasting my time. As it happens, I think that in really good stories the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts. If that weren't so, the following would be a perfectly acceptable version of Hansel and Gretel. Hansel and Gretel were 2 children with a nice father and a nice mother. The nice mother died and the father married a bitch. The bitch wanted the kids out of the way so she would have more money to spend on herself. She bullied her spineless, soft-headed husband into taking Hansel and Gretel into the woods and killing them. The kids' father relented at the last moment, allowing them to live so they could starve to death in the woods instead of dying quickly and mercifully at the blade of his knife. While they were wandering around, they found a house made out of candy, owned by a witch who was into cannibalism. She locked them up and told them that when they were good and fat, she was going to eat them. But the kids got the best of her. Hansel shoved her into her own oven. They found the witch's treasure, and they must have found a map too, because they eventually arrived home again. When they got there, Dad gave the bitch to boot, and they lived happily ever after. The end. I don't know what you think, but for me that version's a loser. The story is there, but it isn't elegant. It's like a caddy with the chrome stripped off and the paint sanded down a dome. It'll go somewhere, but it ain't, glass. I haven't restored all 400 of the missing pages. There is a difference between doing it upright and just being downright vulgar. Some of what was left on the cutting room floor when they turned in the truncated version deserved to be left there, and there it remains. Other things, such as Franny's confrontation with her mother early in the book, seem to add that richness and dimension which I, as a reader, enjoy deeply. Return to Hansel and Gretel for just a moment. You may remember that the wicked stepmother demands that her husband bring her the hearts of the children as proof that the hapless woodcutter has done as she has ordered. The woodcutter demonstrates one dim vestige of intelligence by bringing her the hearts of 2 rabbits. Or take the famous trail of breadcrumbs Hansel leaves behind so he and his sister can find their way back. Thinking dude! But when he attempts to follow the back trail, he finds that the birds have eaten it. Neither of these bits are strictly essential to the plot, but in another way, they make the plot. They're great and magical bits of storytelling. They change what could have been a dull piece of work into a tale which has charmed and terrified readers for over 100 years. I suspect nothing added here is as good as Hansel's trail of breadcrumbs, but I have always regretted the fact, but no one but me, and a few in-house readers at Doubleday, ever met that maniac who simply calls himself the Kid, or witnessed what happens to him outside a tunnel which counterpoints another tunnel half a continent away. The Lincoln Tunnel in New York, which 2 of the characters negotiate earlier in the story. So, here is the Stand, constant reader. Its author originally intended for it to roll out of the showroom. All its charm is now intact for better and worse. The final reason for presenting this version is the simplest. Although it has never been my favorite novel, it is the one people who like my books seem to like the most. When I speak, which is as rarely as possible, people always speak to me about The Stand. They discuss the characters as though they were living people and ask frequently, "Whatever happened to So-So?" As if I got letters from them every now and again. I am inevitably asked if it is ever going to be a movie. The answer, by the way, is probably yes. Will it be a good one? I don't know. Bad or good movies nearly always have a strange, diminishing effect on works of fantasy. Of course, there are exceptions. The Wizard of Oz is an example which springs immediately to mind. In discussions, people are willing to cast various parts endlessly. I've always thought Robert Duvall would make a splendid Randolph Flagg, but I've heard suggest such people as Clint Eastwood, Bruce Dern, and Christopher Walken. They all sound good, just as Bruce Springsteen would seem to make an interesting Larry Underwood if he ever chose to try acting. And based on his videos, I think it would do very well. Although my personal choice would be Marshall Crenshaw. But in the end, I think it's perhaps best for Stu, Larry, Glenn, Franny, Ralph, Tom Cullen, Lloyd, and the Dark Fellow to belong to the reader, who will visualize them through the lens of imagination in a vivid and constantly changing way no camera can duplicate. Movies, after all, are only an illusion of motion comprised of thousands of still photographs. The imagination, however, moves with its own tidal flow. Films, even the best of them, freeze fiction. Anyone who has ever seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and then reads Ken Kesey's novel will find it harder and impossible not to see Jack Nicholson's face on Randall Patrick McMurphy. That's not necessarily bad, but it's limiting. The glory of a good tale is that it is limitless and fluid. A good tale belongs to each reader in its own particular way. Finally, I write for only 2 reasons: to please myself and to please others. In returning to this long tale of dark Christianity, I hope I've done both. October 24th, 1989. Outside, the streets on fire and a world doth waltz. Between what's flesh and fantasy, and the poets down here don't write nothing at all. They just stand back and let it all be, and in the quick of the night they reach for their moment and try to make an honest stand, but they wind up wounded, not even dead tonight in Jungle Land. Bruce Springsteen. And it was clear she couldn't go on. The door was open and the wind appeared. The candles blew and then disappeared. The curtains flew and then he appeared. He said, "Don't be afraid. Come on, Mary." And she had no fear, and she ran to him. And they started to fly. She had taken his hand. "Come on, Mary, don't fear the Reaper," Blue Oyster called. "What's that spell? What's that spell? What's that spell?" Country Joe and the Fish.